Chapter 4 of Mary Barton. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kim Sr. Mary Barton by Elizabeth Clayhorn Gaskell. 4. Old Alice's History. To envy note between the ample sky, to mourn no evil deed, no hour misspent, and like a living violet, silently return in sweets to heaven what goodness lent, then bend between the chastening shower content. Eliot. Another year passed on. The waves of time seem long since to have swept away all trace of poor Mary Barton, but her husband still thought of her, although with a calm and quiet grief, in the silent watches of the night. And Mary would start from her hard-earned sleep and think, in her half-dreamy, half-awakened state, she saw her mother stand by her bedside, as she used to do in the days of long ago, with a shaded candle and an expression of ineffable tenderness while she looked on her sleeping child. But Mary rubbed her eyes and sank back on her pillow awake, and knowing it was a dream, and still in all her troubles and perplexities. Her heart called on her mother for aid, and she thought, if mother had but lived, she would have helped me. Forgetting that the woman's sorrows are far more difficult to mitigate than a child's, even by the mighty power of a mother's love, and unconscious of the fact that she was far superior in sense and spirit to the mother she mourned. Aunt Esther was still mysteriously absent, and people had grown weary of wondering and begun to forget. Barton still attended his club and was an active member of the trades union, indeed more frequently than ever, since the time of Mary's return in the evening was so uncertain, and as she occasionally, in very busy times, remained all night. His chiefest friend was still George Wilson, although he had no great sympathy on the questions that agitated Barton's mind. But their hearts were bound by old ties to one another, and the remembrance of former things gave an unspoken charm to their meetings. Our old friend, the cub-like lad, Jem Wilson, had shot up into the powerful, well-made young man with a sensible face enough, nay, a face that might have been handsome, had it not been here and there marked by the smallpox. He worked with one of the great firms of engineers, who send from out their towns of workshops, engines, and machinery to the dominions of the Tsar and the Sultan. His father and mother were never weary of praising Jem, at all which commendation pretty Mary Barton would toss her head, seeing clearly enough that they wished her to understand what a good husband he would make, and to favour his love, about which he never dared to speak, whatever eyes and looks revealed. One day, in the early winter time, when people were provided with warm, substantial gowns, not likely soon to wear out, and when, accordingly, business was rather slack at Miss Simmonds', Mary met Alice Wilson, coming home from her half-day's work at some tradesman's house. Mary and Alice had always liked each other. Indeed, Alice looked with particular interest on the motherless girl, the daughter of her whose forgiving kiss had comforted her in many sleepless hours. So there was a warm greeting between the tidy old woman and the blooming young work-girl, and then Alice ventured to ask if she would come in and take her tea with her that very evening. "You'll think it dull enough to come just to sit with an old woman like me, but there's a tidy young lass as lives in the floor above, who does plain work. And now and then a bit in your own line, Mary. She's granddaughter to old Job Legh, a spinner, and a good girl she is. Do come, Mary. I've a terrible wish to make you known to each other. She's a genteel-looking lass, too." At the beginning of this speech, Mary had feared the intended visitor was to be no other than Alice's nephew, but Alice was too delicate-minded to plan a meeting, even for her dear Jem, when one would have been an unwilling party, and Mary, relieved from her apprehension by the conclusion, gladly agreed to come. How busy Alice felt! It was not often she had anyone to tea, and now her sense of the duties of a hostess were almost too much for her. She made haste home, and lighted the unwilling fire, borrowing a pair of bellows to make it burn the faster. For herself she was always patient. She let the coals take their time. Then she put on her pattens, and went to fill her kettle at the pump in the next court, and on her way she borrowed a cup. Of odd saucers she had plenty, serving as plates when occasion required. Half an ounce of tea and a quarter of a pound of butter went far to absorb her morning's wages, but this was an unusual occasion. In general, she used herb tea for herself when at home, unless some thoughtful mistress made a present of tea leaves from her more abundant household. The two chairs drawn out for visitors, and duly swept and dusted, an old board arranged with some skill upon two old candle boxes set on end, rather rickety to be sure, but she knew the seat of old, and when to sit lightly. Indeed, the whole affair was more for apparent dignity of position than for any real ease. A little, very little round table, put just before the fire, which by this time was blazing merrily, her unlacquered ancient third-hand tea-tray, arranged with a black teapot, two cups with a red and white pattern, and one with the old friendly willow pattern, and saucers, not to match. On one of the extra supply, the lump of butter flourished away. All these preparations complete, Alice began to look about her with satisfaction, and with a sense of wonder what more could be done to add to the comfort of the evening. She took one of the chairs away from its appropriate place by the table, and putting it close to the broad, large, hanging shelf I told you about when I first described her cellar dwelling, and mounting on it, she pulled towards her an old deal box, and thence a quantity of the oat bread of the north, the clap bread of Cumberland and Westmoreland, and descending carefully with the thin cakes, threatening to break to pieces in her hand, she placed them on the bare table, with the belief that her visitors would have an unusual treat in eating the bread of her childhood. She brought out a good piece of a 4-pound loaf of common household bread as well, and then sat down to rest, really to rest, and not to pretend, on one of the rush-bottomed chairs. The candle was ready to be lighted, the kettle boiled, the tea was awaiting its doom in its paper parcel. All was ready. A knock at the door. It was Margaret, the young workwoman who lived in the rooms above, who, having heard the bustle and the subsequent quiet, began to think it was time to pay her visit below. She was a sallow, unhealthy, sweet-looking young woman, with a careworn look. Her dress was humble and very simple, consisting of some kind of dark stuff gown, her neck being covered by a drab shawl or large handkerchief, pinned down behind and at the sides in front. The old woman gave her a hearty greeting, and made her sit down on the chair she had just left, while she balanced herself on the board seat, in order that Margaret might think it was quite her free and independent choice to sit there. "I cannot think what keeps Mary Barton. She's quite grand with her late hours," said Alice, as Mary still delayed. The truth was, Mary was dressing herself. Yes, to come to poor old Alice's. She thought it worth while to consider what gown she should put on. It was not for Alice, however, you may be pretty sure. No, they knew each other too well. But Mary liked to make an impression, and in this, it must be owned, she was pretty often gratified, and there was this strange girl to consider just now. So she put on her pretty new blue merino, made tight to her throat her little linen collar and linen cuffs, and sallied forth to impress poor gentle Margaret. She certainly succeeded. Alice, who never thought much about beauty, had never told Margaret how pretty Mary was, and as she came in, half blushing at her own self-consciousness, Margaret could hardly take her eyes off her, and Mary put down her long black lashes with a sort of dislike of the very observation she had taken such pains to secure. Can you fancy the bustle of Alice to make the tea, to pour it out, and sweeten it to their liking, to help and help again to clap bread and butter? Can you fancy the delight with which she watched her piled-up clap bread disappear before the hungry girls, and listened to the praises of her home-remembered dainty? "My mother used to send me some clap bread by any north country person. Bless her! She knew how good such things taste when far away from home. Not but what every one likes it. When I was in service, my fellow servants were always glad to share with me. It's a long time ago, yon." "Do tell us about it, Alice," said Margaret. "Why, lass, there's nothing to tell. There was more mouths at home than could be fed. Tom, that's Will's father, you don't know Will, but he's a sailor to foreign parts, had come to Manchester and sent word what terrible lots of work was to be had, both for lads and lasses. So father sent George first. you know George well enough, Mary; and then work was scarce out toward Barton, where we lived.